Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Hello, and welcome to OI Reads, a new series on Ben Franklin's World where we introduce you to new books that we think you'll love and that are published by the Omohundro Institute. I'm Holly White, and I'll be your host. It's no secret that the Omohundro Institute have been proud publishers of award-winning books since 1943. Our guest today is Carolyn Eastman, a professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University and author of the recently published book, The Strange Genius of Mr. O, The World of the United States' First Forgotten Celebrity. During our conversation, Carolyn will introduce us to James Ogilvy, one of early America's first bona fide celebrities. And as we explore Ogilvy's life, we'll also discover what it meant to be a celebrity in the early American Republic, what Americans most feared and worried about during the early days of the United States, and why, despite his celebrity, so few of us remember James Ogilvy today. Carolyn, would you tell us, who was James Ogilvy? How and why does he matter to the history of early America?
During the early 19th century, James Ogilvy was the very face of eloquence. He had been a burned out immigrant schoolteacher who discovered that he had a real knack for the spoken word, for delivering thoughtful and passionate speeches. And in 1808, he decided to abandon the schoolroom and undertake a career as a traveling public speaker. He spoke on some of the country's most pressing civic concerns, and he spent the rest of his life traveling from place to place, selling tickets to his talks. And I think it's easy upon hearing that to think that oratory as a topic sounds hopelessly old-fashioned. It sounds like one of those vestiges of the 19th century that we've now lost and that we're not terribly eager to get back to. But I think it's really important to understand how vital early Americans saw public speaking as a form of communication. I mean, alongside print, they really believed that oratory was crucial to the early United States. And Ogilvy modeled exactly the kind of community discussion that many Americans felt that their country needed. If you read early American letters and diaries, what you would see coming up again and again is a real concern about the future of the country. They believed that their country might be, in fact, so divided that it would fail as a republic. So when early Americans looked back to the two other great republics that had existed in the past, the republics of Greece and Rome, what they saw there was great public speakers who brought people together in a room, who gave them ways of thinking about the problems that they faced and argued about different modes of moving forward. And so what Ogilvy was doing as he did the same thing, he brought people together in a room. He explored all different sides of some of the most important issues of the day, from dueling and female education to the topic of suicide. The people who attended his talks thought together about those topics as he moved through them. And so I think that what Ogilvy was doing was modeling a kind of public performance, but also intellectual thinking about important subjects that Americans didn't have access to otherwise. The reason why Ogilvy matters so much to the history of early America is that he was, in essence, the first great public speaker who vast numbers of early Americans were able to see because he traveled from Maine to Georgia to Tennessee to Kentucky and the Illinois Territory. He traveled to Montreal and Quebec. He went through places like Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York. He was somebody who was terribly eager, not just to make a name for himself, but also to help Americans imagine a kind of maybe not unity, but at least he could get them unified in thinking together about the same subjects. And he succeeded. One of the most remarkable things about his story is how long he succeeded in doing exactly that.
One of the themes Carolyn explores in her book, The Strange Genius of Mr. O, is what it meant to be a celebrity in the early United States. Carolyn, how similar or different was the idea of celebrity during the founding era from how we understand it today?
Focusing on the differences, I think, reveals a lot about life in the early United States when there was no national newspaper. There were a whole bunch of regional or very local newspapers that he needed to use. It reveals a lot about how limited fame could be. For example, at one point he went to Philadelphia and had a great success until a scandal erupted around him. And at that point, when he ultimately left town, the scandal didn't follow him. He went on to start speaking in New York City, and it was as if he started afresh. And so in that way, it wasn't as if a scandal about him had gone viral. He had no agent. He had no one to help him make travel arrangements or booking arrangements. He did everything on his own. He also then had to rely on important, influential figures to help boost his career. Everyone from Thomas Jefferson, who was president when Ogilvy began his career, to John Quincy Adams in Boston, to Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia, to Washington Irving in New York City, and important elite women everywhere he went. He had to constantly please these people. He would maybe become a dinner guest for one group. He would maybe join a group of women in their parlor in the afternoon as they were working on their needlework. And he would essentially perform for them. He would engage in chit chat. He would recite poetry. He would talk about ideas. And the job was incredibly, truly stressful. He always had to be sort of scrounging for more attendees. He was always on the make. He was always working.
To be honest, I had never heard of James Ogilvy. With acquaintances like Jefferson and Adams, why do you think Ogilvy has been forgotten as a figure in the history of the early United States?
Ogilvy was one of the most familiar names during the 1810s. So it's striking to see the extent to which he was forgotten, even by the 1820s. I think part of it had to do with the fact that he very immodestly decided that he wanted to become a permanent celebrity, as he called it. He wanted to attain a kind of position in American culture that would mean that he would never be erased. And he announced that immodest goal very publicly over and over again, including in the introduction to a book that he published in 1816. And it turned out that the book was really terrible. It was badly written. It was redundant, repetitive. It was contradictory. And worst of all, it was derivative of other writers. And maybe the most appalling thing about the book for many American readers was that he included an autobiography that appeared not just immodest, but kind of weird. It's rambling. It tells a lot of stories about past bitternesses and times that he was heckled on stage. It's the kind of book, honestly, that is a goldmine for a historian, but it was a disaster for him as a public figure. People savaged the book. And it led a number of people to question whether he had really been as talented as they had thought as a public speaker. And so when he then, fairly quickly after publishing the book, left the United States for the UK to continue his career as a public speaker, a lot of Americans kind of wanted to put their admiration of Ogilvy behind them. And so they began erasing him from the history of the rise of what they called a golden age of American eloquence in the United States, a period of time when you saw major public speakers like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Ralph Waldo Emerson, on to Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and Abraham Lincoln and so on, come to the fore. A period when Americans really took pride in the way that oratory, the spoken eloquence, became crucial to their culture. Americans ceased to place Ogilvy in that pantheon. And I think that that also had a huge effect on how he was remembered by the 20th century and why a scholar like Richard Beale Davis would see him more as a kind of comical figure in American history rather than an influential one.
We may have forgotten who James Ogilvy was, but clearly his story lived on in the archives. Carolyn, what types of sources did you use to write The Strange Genius of Mr. O? And how did your sources inform the way you wrote Ogilvy's story?
Oh, I used all kinds of sources. Manuscript sources, published sources, visual sources. The hardest thing about this project was the fact that Ogilvy, as a traveling speaker, never kept his own papers. And so the papers that still exist, written by him, written to him, and written about him, are scattered all over the United States as well as the UK. I spent time in archives up and down the East Coast, in Ohio and Kentucky, in Montreal and Quebec City, as well as in Scotland and England. And it was really part of the story of this book is trying to gather these things together and make a coherent story about a man who spent his life on the road. The craziest source I found is a really remarkable letter that I saved for analysis till the very end of the book. It's a letter that Ogilvy wrote as he was trying to come to grips with his own emotional ups and downs in the light of his own health, really. And it was a letter that I found at the very end of my research and completely changed how, well, not just how I thought about Ogilvy and his reasons for undertaking this whole career, but also it changed how I decided to write the book. I decided to save it for the very end of the book because it wound up giving the book a narrative arc that's incredibly satisfying. And it's also a narrative twist that I never would have expected when I started the project. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I want people to read the book and I want them to get there. But I will never forget that moment of sitting in the archive and realizing that I had to rethink a lot about what I understood about this man and his career.
I have one last question for you. If you could only use 4 words to describe your book, what would they be?
If I could describe my book using only 4 words, it would be eloquence, opium, scandal, and togas.
Of all the words Carolyn could have chosen, opium and toga were 2 I did not expect. As Carolyn helped us see, The Strange Genius of Mr. O, the world of the United States' first forgotten celebrity, is the story of a remarkable performer and the story of the fledgling United States. Those who have read the book describe it as a page-turner that reads more like a mystery novel than a history book. So just how do the words toga and opium fit into the story of James Ogilvy, America's first forgotten celebrity? Find out by picking up your own copy of The Strange Genius of Mr. O. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/Mr. O and be sure to make use of your special listener-only discount code 01BFW to save 40% on the cover price. Again, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Mr. O and use the code 01BFW to save 40%. This episode of Ben Franklin's World is supported by an American Rescue Plan grant to the Omohundro Institute from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Production assistance for the podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Jessica Brabble, Liz Covart, Martha Howard, and Holly White. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com.